Hello, everyone. We're going to get started for tonight's Future Talk. So welcome, and thank you again for joining us for our talk, Rethinking the Unthinkable, Scenario Planning the Local and Alternative Climate Futures. My name is Katie Ventivolio, and I'm a project manager with the New Silk Roads for our Futures programming. Tonight's Futures talk will address scenario planning, which has become an increasingly popular tool for imagining the future and sharing these future visions or predictions widely. But with all this emphasis on scenario planning, what we'd like to address in today's talk is whether or not scenarios are in fact expanding our imaginatory capacities to envision alternative, radical, or different futures, or if they're playing a different role. To explore these questions, I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Chiara Di Leone, who will be critically examining scenario planning by positioning it in the larger tradition of future imagining infrastructures, using a wide set of case studies. Chiara Di Leone is a writer and researcher on economic narratives, anticipatory governance, and climate interventions, among other things. Her essays appear in several publications, including Tank, KALEIDOSCOPE, Strelka Magazine, and RealReview. She also regularly advises institutions through design research with clients including BBC R&D and Serpentine galleries. Today's talk, depending on where you're joining us from, will be moderated by Arthur Steiner, who is an art historian who is passionate about the role of arts and culture and digital technology in tackling 21st century challenges. He's led various innovative programs for HEVOS to develop the cultural sector and social impact. And he is also the co-founder of Digital Earth, a fellowship for artists to imagine radically different digital futures. He is also the editor of the forthcoming publication, Vertical Atlas. So for tonight, before we start, a few housekeeping notes. This Futures talk will start with a presentation by Chiara, followed by a moderated discussion, and then we will open up a question and answer session with questions from the audience. For the Q&A, we will be collecting questions throughout the talk via the chat box, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. You can submit a question at any time during the talk, so please don't feel that you need to wait until the end to submit a question. We kindly ask that you phrase your question in the form of a question. And if you'd like to add your name and affiliation, a little bit of background, feel free to do so. Finally, please note the webinar is being recorded and that we will be sharing this video publicly online after the talk. Future talks are hosted by New Silk Roads, where we offer a range of futures thinking programs focused on collectively imagining preferred futures. These programs are grounded in exploration over prediction, possibility over certainty, and we work with communities, companies, and organizations alike to imagine what could happen, not just what will happen. We especially look to lessons of the past to push beyond nostalgia and to use history as a springboard for imagining novel futures. We're interested in how to transcend future thinking tropes, such as utopia, dystopia, techno-optimism. And recently, we convened a 3-month futures lab in Tunis, Tunisia, which was focusing on imagining alternative futures for just food systems. Our Futures Talks program is supported by Greenworks, which is led by HEVOS and funded by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And now, with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Chiara.
What I'm going to talk about today is once again the use of the scenario planning technique with climate policy, climate change policy, and especially about the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the most authoritative institution about climate change today. And I'm going to talk about the kind of limits of this technique and the fact that this is a specific technique that we use and not the only one, and then a little bit about the history of this technique. I think that in the moment at which we are historically right now, there is a lot of talk about futures and different kind of predictive techniques, and I think it's important to examine them critically. So let's jump right into that. So let's start by considering the first ever comedy about climate change, which is Adam McKay's Don't Look Up. It's a film about 2 low-level astronomers who must go on a giant media tour to warn mankind of an approaching comet that will destroy planet Earth, and the comet is an allegory for climate change. In the film, the consequences of not listening to the scientists pushes humanity to an imminent catastrophe. So In a key scene of the movie, one of the astronomers is traveling to leak the news of a giant asteroid that comet that will eat Earth, but he's anxious because he lacks communication skills and media training. So a NASA scientist that you see in this picture tries to reassure him by saying, "Relax, you're telling a story, keep it simple." And he says not to use math, to which the astronomer replies, "But it's all math." Climate science is indeed mostly math, but the knowledge that it produces is not all math. Data measurements and equations alone are not enough to predict what might happen decades from now. So climate scientists must deal with uncertainty and make predictions to produce plausible pictures of future realities. For instance, the degree at which the Arctic will melt, or the ocean acidify in the next few years will depend on whether or not governments will find ways to reduce carbon emissions and to coordinate geopolitically. So these narratives that are behind the climate projections drive the climate projections. So the ways in which we frame the future is incredibly important to the climate science itself. These two things cannot be separated. So the IPCC accommodates for the uncertainty of the future by offering numerous possible visions of what it might be like. And this popular heuristic is called scenario planning, which can be defined as a series of multiple non-exclusive futures that are called scenarios. Scenarios are made of these two different ingredients very explicitly, the math and the stories. So the first element, which is the math that you see represented in this visual rendering of climate projections, refers to representative concentration pathways, RPCs, and they describe how much heat reaches the surface of the Earth, which is called radiating forcing, associated with varying levels of greenhouse gases. The second element, the stories, is the shared socioeconomic pathways, SSPs. And these are imagined global social and economic conditions that are associated with different emissions. So both the math and the stories contribute to the making of climate projections, and both need each other for the future to take shape at all. So there was never a problem with the math side of things. The very, very popular reports that came out in the 70s, authored by the Club of Rome, which is called The Limits to Growth, has been right. So we've been right since the 70s. This report predicted exactly the kind of catastrophic and levels of emissions that we are on track of. So the math was right, but the story was wrong. As historian of science Kevin Baker recently tweeted, the Limits to Growth report, it did not work to generate trust, credibility, political organization, or political will. So in a sense, it was right mathematically, but it did not work to do the thing that it was intended to do, to change society in a way that would be positive and it wouldn't cause an ecological catastrophe. So what's wrong with the stories? The truth is that there is very little that's alternative in the IPCC scenarios, in these plausible alternative states of human and natural societies and microscale that you see here. These social and economic aspects of the IPCC future scenario are, I argue, different flavors of extractive capitalism. They all include economic growth, they all include obsolete measurements of well-being and undefinable concepts like sustainability. So what is the reason for this conservative nature of climate scenarios? Well, the main reason is the institutional nature of the process. The IPCC report must be approved line by line by 197 countries. So it seems very unlikely that some revolutionary socioeconomic configuration, which is indeed what we need to overcome the climate crisis that we're going through, it is very unlikely that some radical, again, socioeconomic configuration would emerge when the most powerful nations on the planet need to reach consensus of what kind of politics will and should be implemented in the coming decades. As a result, these social and economic pathways end up reproducing a future that's all too familiar. So this kind of some people might argue that I'm being a bit socially deterministic here, that, you know, it's all about the parts per millimeter carbon dioxide emissions, and that stories and that politics doesn't matter here. We should all listen to the scientists. But the narratives cannot be ignored in favor of an imagined scientific truth. There is no such thing as a pure, uncontaminated mathematical solution to climate change. So the way to go beyond this very conservative climate futures, I argue, is to reform scenario planning, the technique itself. So in order to do that, I think it's very useful to understand a little bit about the history of the technique, where it comes from, why it became popular, and to kind of critically examine why we use this way of envisioning the future instead of other ways. So to do that, we have to go back in the past a little bit, at least to the 1950s. So in the 50s, American war analysts at RAND Corporation, which was the nonprofit military research unit in the United States. So to them, the prospect of a nuclear war was a complex but finite set of probabilities. If only they could find the right game theoretical approach, then the appropriate strategy would emerge and America could be made safe. But there was one analyst at RAND Corporation that was called Herman Kahn, and to him, relying on wargaming and operation research alone to overcome all of the uncertainties of the Cold War, it was absurd. So the simulations that the analysts were working on were correct mathematically, but they did not work in the sense that they led to paralyzing anxiety. So what Kahn did was looking for ways to include storytelling and human intuition in the dry science of war analysis. But the scientists and researchers at RAND were intentionally staying far away from the frivolous business of storytelling, also not to undermine their scientific expertise and the scientific nature of the research that we're trying to communicate and they were trying to kind of use as a pretext for producing the knowledge that we're producing. So Herman Kahn had no narrative tools at his disposal, so he had to make his own. And naturally, he went where worlds are made, destroyed, and remade every day, which is Hollywood. RAND Corporation was also in California, so I wasn't far from all the screenwriters and all the people that were working on also propaganda films for the States in the 50s at that point. So he came up with the scenario planning method. The word scenario specifically was suggested by Leo Rosten, who was a comedy screenwriter by day and a RAND analyst at night. And it comes from the genre of Italian theater called Commedia dell'arte, which you see pictured in the smaller frame. And the term was obsolete. The term scenario was not something that Hollywood writers were really using that much, but Herman Kahn liked it, not so much. Herman Kahn really liked it because it put emphasis not so much on forecasting, but on creating stories. So basically, Herman Kahn thought that in contrast to gaming, which posited a discrete set of outcomes, the objective of scenario planning was, as science historian Jenny Anderson argues in her book, The Future of the World, to think of a potentially unlimited series of probable and improbable futures, including famously the unthinkable. In Herman Kahn's words, why would one expect a realistic discussion on nuclear war not to be disturbing? And indeed, these discussions were very, very disturbing, but they were horrifying and entertaining at once, because all of the writings of Herman Kahn on thermonuclear war were very, very popular. And through comedy and through storytelling and through using human intuition, he made this very abstract and very sort of distant idea of thermonuclear war felt very, very emotional and very close to Americans at that point. So much so that Stanley Kubrick made a film called Dr. Strangelove. And the Dr. Strangelove that you see here is exactly a representation of, is exactly based on Herman Kahn. And Herman Kahn even trying to get the rights from this film, but he had no luck. Stanley Kubrick didn't want to give him any money for that. But what I wanted to say is that in Dr. Strangelove, the Rand Corporation is dubbed as Bland Corporation, which we can see as a foreshadowing of how diluted and boring scenarios of future war environment would become over the coming decades. And indeed, by the time that the scenario technique landed on the lap of the IPCC, the scenarios were completely bland and very much reproductive of the present. Here, what you see is that basically what I argue for is that this approach defeats the purpose of scenarios. It fails to open up different worlds and possibilities that were close to us. So using scenarios as a way to reproduce the present gives us soft, tolerable corporate jargon and turns bad news into media appropriate content, helping people digest tragic and unspeakable terror as business as usual. And here in this picture, you can see that the climate science and the math behind the climate projections has become increasingly more high resolution, but the socioeconomic aspects remain the same. And so my question is, as the resolution of climate models gets better, why don't the policies and the narrative side of things get better too? So for this talk, I wanted to try and propose some kind of more propositional aspect and not just critique. So I wanted I did some research into how the SSPs and the IPCC scenarios are applied at a local scale, and whether or not the local can be a site for radical future making. And to do that, we need to understand that there are two kind of responses to climate change. There is a mitigation of climate change, which reduces the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And there is the adaptation to climate change. And so at a planetary scale, we can do both. We can do mitigation, so kind of coordinate amongst different nations to reduce emissions and to kind of proactively engage into carbon capture or different technologies to stop climate change at a planetary scale. But at a local scale, we can mostly invest into adaptation, so just adapting to what's coming. And I want to kind of share with you a case study, an academic article that describes this case study. This called Scenario Planning for Climate Adaptation in Agricultural System. The site for this is Sub-Saharan Africa agriculture, and in particular a site in Nigeria. And basically what's argued in this article is that agricultural systems in Sub-Saharan Africa are expected to be heavily impacted by climate change, but the specific nature of this impact is highly uncertain due to the lack of data and localized climate modeling. So detailed downscale quantitative models are frequently not available for decision makers at local scales. So scenario planning in agricultural system at local scales in Africa may therefore take a more qualitative approach rooted in experiential knowledge, the same kind of experiential knowledge that's obviously lacking in the IPCC report. It's for good reasons, because they are abstracting a kind of scale that cannot be experienced, which is the one of the entire planet. This is an example of a table of community-generated scenario matrix for Akpo in Nigeria, which depicts a combination of different drivers for different plausible futures. And I found this kind of framing of what the uncertainties and risks in that specific area are to be very, very important kind of knowledge that must be matched with the math that's coming from above from the climate scientists. And I think that there is way more room for imagining more radical and different futures at a local scale, because these futures do not need to be approved by 196 countries, and they can just be based on the more sort of local knowledge. So what I argue in the end is that I argue for a combination of experiential knowledge at a local scale and with the math and the abstracted planetary scale nature of IPCC reports. And of course, there are many, many different organizations and many, many different groups that work on this. But I argue that we should learn from the local, not just as a site for adapting the planetary to the local, but also the planetary should learn from the local and from the experiences that the local communities deal with through climate adaptation. Scenarios are very, very important, and their importance cannot be overrated, because they are not simply lenses to help envision possible futures, but also fulcrums to motivate action for turning desired futures into reality. And this is actually a direct quote from a paper that I'll share later that's titled "How Climate Scenarios Lost Touch with Reality." But I really like this quote because he really kind of embodies why I am so interested person into scenarios and why I think they are so important. So in conclusion, by crafting local futures based on both global climate sciences and the qualitative knowledge that can only be accessed at a local scale, alternative futures can stir meaningful change and give communities the agency they need over the future in order to adapt to climate change. So this is the end of my talk, my presentation for now. I welcome questions and can't wait to discuss with everybody. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Chiara. That was a really inspiring and great talk. And wow, also amazing examples. I think I watched all the movies that you that you gave it as an example. I really love them. And yeah, also great arguments to combine, to reform like scenario planning in this way and to connect it with stories and also with the planetary scale information, as well as like the local knowledges and practices. Maybe just to start with a couple of questions, and then we turn to the audience, because I see also there are some questions from the audience for you. But maybe first to kick it off myself. In your presentation, and I think it's the last maybe the last slide. You described scenarios as a way to motivate action, to turn desired futures into reality. In your experience, in your research and your experience with scenarios, what specific elements, whether the narrative or maybe the aesthetics, help to really steer this concrete action? What are these elements that that increase in a way a feeling of agency among people?
Yeah, so what I've been focusing on are the narratives and in scenario planning at an institutional scale. So I think that in that sense, the kind of importance of scenarios as fulcrum to kind of foster action is clear. The scenarios are used by governments to write policies that address climate change. So basically they provide a menu of what's possible, and everything that's outside of that menu is not something that legislators are going to consider, or that something is going to be very, very difficult for them to legitimize. So of course they tend to rely on the knowledge that's produced by the IPCC scenarios. And so in that sense, the kind of theory of action that's there, it's that that's the menu, the set of possible futures, and then they get turned into policy. And so in that sense, it is a fulcrum for envisioning desired and plausible futures. There's also another aspect of scenario planning that's perhaps more at the local scale, or more it has to do with the general audience. That, but it's a slightly different question of how does public opinion, how do public opinions like shape policy and shape the kind of action that we want to see from governments at a planetary level to kind of stop climate change. And I think these are questions that are very much open. But again, yeah, in a very concrete sense, scenarios do shape policy already. So yeah.
Thanks. And what I also found fascinating is, I mean, you also mentioned like this history, yeah, of the Rand corporation, but also like you mentioned like also this link with cinema and cinematic techniques and the use of black comedy and play and other essential elements in scenario planning. I think like, I mean, when I participated in scenario workshops, like and when it's getting to this level of like imagining the future, and you're using maybe elements of these techniques, how do you avoid in a way that it becomes too, you know, fantastical and too like you know, almost like yeah, like too maybe too dystopic or too utopic, and that it gets too much into the realm of, let's say, science fiction rather than where it's actually useful as a way, yeah, in scenario planning.
Yeah, so I think that let me start by saying that yeah, scenarios that do come from theater, and they do come from you know, cinema screenwriting, and they have been used to deal with by Herman Kahn to deal with nuclear war, because it was a way to kind of exercise it, to kind of think, okay, let's think about this horrible, you know, thing through something that's light. So this is what people in Hollywood all the time, we don't have to do all the time. We don't have to take things too seriously. We can just go into this fiction mode and just, you know, generate all of these different futures, and it doesn't matter because it's just a little paragraph and we can forget about it. I think yes, there is definitely the risk of going a bit too utopian or too dystopian, and there is certainly that temptation all the time. That's why we have films like Don't Look Up, where everything gets destroyed, or we have Marvel films where everything almost gets destroyed and then somebody saves the day, because that's more appealing and it's more interesting and it's more fun. And of course, we tend to fall for stories that are more archetypal, where there is a hero and where, you know, things go really, really bad or really, really well. And of course, we never imagine the boring, annoying futures that actually we end up living in. So I don't know. I think at an institutional level, because there's so many mechanisms to control, to kind of like revise the future, they don't somehow end up being very utopian and very dystopian. So I don't see that as being a huge concern. But there is an interesting fact about this, that's J.G. Ballard, the science fiction writer. He was one of the first science fiction writers that wrote about climate change, even when nobody was worried about climate change. He was, and he saw the urgency of writing and making films about climate change, and so that climate change would get out of what he called invisible literature, which is everything that's in the reports that nobody reads, or email, you know, mail or fax or whatever kind of gray invisible literature was there at that point. So I think that actually working together with people that actually do work in screenwriting and actually do work in films would probably not be the worst idea for institutions, because they do know how stories are structured. So when we do know that we tend to go for a very utopian, very dystopian, then maybe we can avoid that. And so I think interdisciplinarity there is very important, and being aware of the tropes so you don't fall for that. It's also very important, and maybe that's a way that in which this can be avoided.
Thanks so much. I heard just here in between that we have a lot of questions coming. So let me see if I have like one more or maybe two more questions myself before we move to the audience. Maybe just to elaborate a bit more about the local in your presentation, and you emphasize the power of the local as the site for radical future making. And similarly, future thinking is always influenced in a way to a specific history, and you made it also clear yourself how that is always rooted in a specific time and in a specific place. And how can we include, or how can we work with this local, maybe the local histories? You mentioned data connected to a specific place when we are doing this future scenario building. And I know there are a lot of people here in the audience also in very specific places and specific communities, so it would be very interesting to know.
Yeah, so one thing about this is so there is a way the knowledge travels from planetary abstracted to climate modeling to local, and the resolution of this is being improving. It's been getting better. Last year, with the latest IPCC assessment report, the IPCC came out with this map that's called the IPCC Atlas, I believe. And basically, they show, you can go with a cursor on the map, and they show how climate change will influence a specific area. And this is part of an effort to kind of be more granular with climate predictions, not just at a global scale, but also at smaller scale, so that people locally can adapt in different ways, but also so that it is in a way more tangible. If you can understand how climate change is going to impact your specific city, then people believe that that's going to make a difference. So that was also the rationale behind doing this. But what I'm arguing for is actually to have some kind of knowledge infrastructure that allows for the local knowledge to go up, to travel up to the IPCC and to the people that make climate models, and so that it should go both ways. And I am not so sure this is the case right now. So I don't really believe so much, or like I would like for this dichotomy between local experiential knowledge and abstracted total scientific knowledge to be dismantled. And of course, there are many people who were doing this, many academics who've been thinking about this much better than I did. And I think that this dichotomy should somehow be broken, and that would be very beneficial for both the big climate science and the local adaptation to climate change. If there were more communication channels and kind of shared knowledge platforms that would facilitate this, so both kind of understanding what the quantitative data the locals should deal with are, and what the experiential learnings that local practices develop are, and how they can inform planetary scale modeling.
Thanks so much for that. I think we are going to move to the questions from the audience. Let me see what is coming in. One question, the first question we got is scenario planning of the rent kind comes out from the Cold War and the context of nuclear annihilation. Its other big use was the corporate sphere by the likes of Shell. How does that historical baggage help or hurt the use of scenario planning for fighting climate change? Are there some historical legacy elements of scenario planning that we perhaps should leave in the past and replace with something else. So it's about like the legacy, the historical aspect, and should we how should we relate to that?
Yeah, that's a huge question I've been trying to answer myself. Yeah, there is that suspicion that like how can a Cold War military technique help us address climate change, which is not really something you can shoot at. And there is the intuition that there is something wrong there, and I very much have that. I've been searching for kind of evidence that would support that, and in the meantime I've kind of wandered around and I'm still trying to make sense of that. For now, it is very interesting that between Cold War and the IPCC, the scenario planning technique did go through Shell and through energy companies. It was one of the first management gurus, Pierre Bock, who made the technique famous in the corporate world because he predicted through scenario planning this oil crisis in the 70s. And he was right. And so Shell was somehow doing much better than the other energy companies. Although there are some people that argue that this myth making of Pierre Bock was something that was orchestrated through the hiring of several ghostwriters. I don't know, it's all very bizarre and very interesting. But what the biggest contradiction that emerged, and one of the most interesting contradictions in my opinion, is that between the 50s, when scenario planning was invented to think about this like crazy outlandish scenarios, and now there is a trend that, I mean, scenario planning is almost used for the opposite of what it was invented for. It was invented to think about futures that are completely outside, and now there are disclaimers. Oh, we're just modeling business as usual. So, I don't really know how all the kind of intellectual legacy of the Cold War play into this, precisely. But I have identified like a few contradictions and things that I look forward to kind of digging more into. I think Jenny Anderson in the Future of the World does a really good job at analyzing the history of scenario planning from a history of social science perspective. So maybe in that book there will be more answers. But it was a great question. Thank you
so much. And another question that we just got is, scenarios are becoming more and more popular future thinking techniques. That's a statement. But as you shared, scenarios are also becoming more bland. If this is how most people are exposed to scenarios, do you have specific suggestions that we can use to get people into a more creative and radical mindset?
Yeah, I don't know if it is the most popular futures technique. Probably, I think most likely it is. But I do think that scenarios in general become sort of infrastructural, because everybody knows what worst case scenario is, best case scenario, or everybody understands the future into this kind of menu of different plausible futures. But it wasn't always like this. Before the 50s, there was just one future, and the prediction was really big. It was like your prediction was either right or it was wrong. It's not like, oh, it could be this or it could be that. No, it was a completely different paradigm. And there is a very interesting paper about this that's called World Futures by Arjan Williams, who was a scholar at Yale, and he attributes this going from one singular forecasting approach to the future to multiple futures, to the appreciation of Oriental philosophy that people at Rand and in other places in California and the kind of most important intellectual figures at the time had. And so, in Oriental philosophy, the future is not like one thing that it's inevitably going to happen in one way, but there are always like parallel futures. And so he argues that. I'm not I don't know in practical terms how scenario planning can be used in a kind of very, very radical way. I mean, I've suggested some things, but I think that kind of knowing about the history and knowing about different kind of explanations for why scenario planning is what we have and why scenario planning is so popular, I think that might be a way to also critically use this technique and maybe produce something that's a bit more original.
Great, and then I think that also relates to the next question, your point of scenarios becoming more infrastructural. Someone is asking, what is the scope of scenario planning? Is it very particular to planning in the techno-political infrastructures, or also do you think it's viable to rethink it in broader contexts, like future making of different political forms, or even subjectivity?
I think scenario planning has been used for virtually anything, and virtually at any scale, and virtually in any kind of organization, from a family to a company to any kind of I mean, the International Energy Association, IEA, they use scenarios every year to forecast how the energy market is gonna move forward. And actually, there is something interesting that happened there. There was a letter of state that some climate scientists and activists and different stakeholders wrote to the IEA, asking them to get rid of the business as usual scenario, which was like, everything is going great, we're burning fossil fuel until there is no more. Yeah, there is climate change, but we don't, that's fine, that's good for us, that's profitable. And people were outraged by this, and they asked them to get rid of the business as usual scenario, and they actually did. And now they only kind of have scenarios that are in line with the Paris Agreement. Of course, it doesn't make them good. They still are the fossil fuel guys, and they still are bad. But I thought that was an interesting moment in for scenario planning, because there was a moment where people really understood, okay, these scenarios are very important, because if you tell us that business as usual is this, then how can regulators and how can companies will plan for that. They will put out resources on the side for that. They will plan to drill more, and so on and so forth. And so I thought that was really important moment. But yeah.
Thanks. Yes, and then we have someone who asked you to reflect on and your thoughts on the following sobering headline, which says Dubai, November 5th, 2016, climate change threatens to wipe out areas of the Islamic world within 2 decades. And this is a quote, I think, from Aga Khan. And the question is, has any scenario planning done in the Islamic world, or do you know if there is anything perhaps in relation to scenario planning in the Islamic world? I don't know.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't speak the language, and I am really not the right person to ask you. But I know some people. I know somebody I've been working with, Laura Kuguzi, and she's been living in Egypt for a long time, and she probably would know how to answer this better. But yeah, that's a great workshop. You should do some workshop on that, and I'm curious to see what comes out.
I was going to say, join also one of the New Silk Road workshops, because New Silk Road is also doing things like that in North Africa and in the Middle East. So get in touch with the guys from the Silk Roads. And another question, we have a lot of questions. How do funding sources for scenario planning influence the outcomes? So of course, there's a lot of money also going into this, and the whole question of financialization. So yeah, how could you reflect on that?
That's a really good question. I think there are of course economic interests, and when the money comes from the people that are kind of championing certain views, well, most likely the outcomes of that radical imagination exercise is going to be something that doesn't really upset the funders so much. And yeah, I don't think that's the dynamic there is different from any other kind of enterprise. I don't think that the knowledge making exercise of future of scenario planning is so different. But there is also something interesting that happens sometimes. Like energy companies, they are relentlessly greenwashing themselves, so they're actually interested in envisioning these very radical futures, and because it sort of liberates them from actually having to do things in a strange way. So I think it could go either ways, and that also it's important to say that I am not advocating for just imagining different futures and just kind of be fantastical, and once we've done that, then everything will be perfect because we have the right imagination and we can think about better things, and so we'll do them. No, because sometimes it actually has the opposite effect. Sometimes having all this utopian beautiful words kind of liberates institutions from actually having to invest and having to do something about it. Once you have the right story and you can communicate it and people buy into that, then you maybe don't have to do much. So it's a very slippery slope between like, let's write a poem and do something very imaginative about climate change, and actually engaging with the narratives that go into the scientific production of knowledge, which are the ones that for me are the most important.
Yes, and then we have also someone who is asking about the role of AI in scenario planning. Do you know if it has already been explored as an accurate predictor of planetary change and possible futures, and how are the results perceived?
So in a very basic interpretation of the word AI, like as a statistical making of regressions, statistical regressions, yes. I mean, the climate models produce over 100,000 scenarios. And then, the scientists and the social scientists kind of pick the ones that kind of fit into the SSPs. So yeah, a few things about this. One is that none of these 100,000 scenarios in the latest report pictured a future where a 1.5 degree warming is possible. They were all over the 1.5 degree warming. So leaving stories on the side and just looking at, the hard math side of things, this is reality. Unless, we start doing crazy carbon capture things and tomorrow, which wasn't modeled for, and I think that's a good thing. And the second thing is that I think applying AI to scenario making could be really interesting, because you could make the kind of biases more explicit, or you could select for certain features. Randomization is very important. Herman Kahn was using, he published this book that was very popular. That's called 1,000 Random Digits, or 10,000. I don't know, a lot of random digits, and it's a book just of numbers, random numbers. And at that point, he was using Monte Carlo simulations, but to generate these random numbers in the beginning, it was literally picking numbers from a hat. And now we don't have to do that. We have much more elaborate ways to include randomness. And I can't believe that randomness was a great tool to think about new futures. And I think that things like AI or like more advanced ways of computing could potentially help researchers think of different words. So yeah, sure. I'm not aware of any attempts, but now I feel like I should really look into that. So thanks for the question.
As you can see, there's a power cut here, but thankfully I'm on my mobile phone. I'm in Egypt, so from the dark, the last question. What strategies do you see for creating scenario plans that do not focus on a kind of single actor driving history, like kind of hero journey and this kind of this kind of this kind of journeys from a hero from the movies, like Marvel movies, but rather focus on a kind of like more macroeconomic scale, class struggle, while also creating a kind of compelling story? This is the last question we got.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think maybe AI or randomness and computation can be one way to approach this. Yeah, I think also comedy and I think theater, as opposed to cinema, could be good, interesting ways to think about different kind of storytelling. Because if you look at comedy and like Russian comedy or kind of older plays, they're not about like linear narratives of progress. It's about ridiculing things and laughing at things and kind of destroying the world, right? Or rather than like having this like linear narrative of triumphing over whatever, nature, evil, whatever. So I feel like this, on one hand, the hero's journey is kind of embedded in our cognitive understanding of the world, but we have proved that we are able to make stories that go beyond that. And I think it is our moment of very cinematic, like feature films, like Marvel and so on. It's a very specific way to tell stories, but it's not the only one. And I feel like people are getting tired of that. That's why you have TikToks and more like non-narrative ways of engaging with things that go beyond storytelling. And I feel like that's gonna percolate into climate science. I don't know, that could be interesting. But yeah, I mean, for now at an institutional level, I think just kind of using the technique in a critical way is certainly the first step towards that.
Thanks. And then the last question, I think, from the new Silk Roads team is if you could recommend maybe 3 text or podcasts or books or maybe even artworks for the audience to read, because I know, there are a lot of people also that joined the Future Labs. So what are your most recent inspirations?
So I think I mentioned it 4 times probably, but there is this very foundational book by Jenny Anderson, an historian, that's called The Future of the World, and it's really good. This paper I just mentioned, World Futures by Arjan Williams, that's about the esoteric and Oriental philosophy explanation for the turn from one predictive future forecasting to many. And there is another book that's called The Worlds of Herman Kahn by Sharon Dabrizi. I'm not sure I pronounced the name right, but it's a really great book. And these are my recommendations for now. I rewatched Doctor Strangelove recently, and I really enjoyed it. So maybe with this new information, if you watch it again, you'll have a good time. I don't know.
I also watched it recently. It's I can also completely recommend it. It's really good. Thanks so much. This was really good.